This and all talks at the 2019 JavaScript for WordPress Conference are brought to you in part by our sponsors Pantheon, a high-performance hosting platform with agile developer tools. Check them out at pantheon.io.
Hey everybody, welcome back to our 7th talk in the Gutenberg track of the JavaScript for WordPress conference. Kelly Dwan is a developer from Boston, Massachusetts. She writes JavaScript for Automatic, where she worked on a range of projects from WordPress.com to a new interface for WooCommerce to the first React-based theme on WordPress.org. Prior to Automatic, she worked at 10up at a range of client sites from small business websites to higher education to enterprise and big media. She's passionate about accessibility, both on the web and in real life. So with that, I will just hand it over to you, and good luck on your talk.
Great, thanks. So hi everyone. As you heard, I'm Kelly, or Rael, and you can find me pretty much everywhere on the internet as Rael. I am a developer at Automatic. In my time there, I've worked a bit on Jetpack, WordPress.com, and most recently on WooCommerce, specifically on the product blocks. So some of those you can find in WooCommerce core, but we really took inspiration from WordPress and the Gutenberg plugin and have created a feature plugin for kind of like upcoming feature iteration. So if you're interested in the future of WooCommerce, that's something to watch. Anyway, so today my talk is called Breaking Apart Block Data. And I really submitted this talk because I wanted to kind of dive in and see how the data that users enter into blocks is stored and retrieved. So maybe if you've looked into this, you've seen this chart on the GitHub for Gutenberg. It's a bit complicated. So, but it's a good overview of all of the moving parts of data in the editor. But we're really only going to be focusing on the left side of things, so I kind of rewrote it to be a little simple. So we're only going to talk about how content is saved into the database and pulled back out into a way for the JavaScript in your editor to, fit into that React-friendly state that it lives. So a little bit less theoretical, we can look at the editor. How is a block actually saved? In Gutenberg, you can actually switch into the code editor, which will let you view the HTML that is like saved into the database. It's just the post content. So that would look like this. And this is kind of the skeleton of Gutenberg, I suppose. So each block you can see from the left side, we have a heading block, the latest posts block, and an image. And then on the right side, you see its like underlying data structure, essentially. It has, each block is wrapped in an HTML comment, and it each has this specific syntax. Sometimes there's this JSON in this comment, and so some data is in there. And then sometimes some of the data is in the HTML itself, like with the caption for the bread, for the image. But like latest posts is only the comment, the content. It doesn't render any HTML to the post content. So anyway, behind the scenes, there's a parser that runs over all of this content, which splits apart these blocks. And then that runs this kind of predefined parsing function over each block, which pulls out the data that you need for your specific block. So it's really set up on a block basis. So when you create a new block, you're going to, you can set up this data however you'd like. So today we're really going to be talking about how the different ways that you can set up your data for using here. The first step to that would be to register a block type. And so for that, you have this function, and you give it essentially two things, which is the name of the block. And this needs to be a unique name, and it's usually prefixed with something. So core blocks always prefix with core/text, core/code. WooCommerce, we prefixed with WooCommerce. Here, this is an example recipe block that I wrote, and so I prefixed it with Rael. So it needs to be unique, otherwise it won't register correctly. But that's really all you need to know about that. The next part is the big part of blocks. This is the configuration object where all of the information about your block needs to live. So it describes the block you're writing, things like title and icon. Category tells it where to put the block in the inserter. And then you set up your attributes data, and edit and save are also set up here. So I'm not actually going to talk about editing. We're not going to talk about UI. We're just going to talk about how things are saved and how things are pulled out. But one thing you will notice as we kind of walk through this is that you're kind of expected to know the structure of your block before, or at least while you're setting up the data. So I'd kind of almost recommend ignoring the idea of data at first and just kind of write out sketches of the edit and save functions first with some fake data. That way you have a good idea of what your structure looks like. And then you can kind of pull that into how it works. So to that end, let's talk about this save function first. So saving a block is, it means converting the content that you're editing into a way that can be saved into the database. So basically a string. You'll probably want to save something that has HTML. That way it can also serve as a fallback for if the site owner disables your plugin, they'll still get some of their content to display. So save should be a function that returns either like a React element or a string. Usually you'll do something like a React element. So this example is pretty much the most simple you can have. It's a block that just saves content to a paragraph tag. This part you can get as complicated as you want is if you want to add in nested HTML, more like conditional content depending on attributes that are set, as long as it returns something that can be converted into a string. It ends up saving something that looks like this. This example saves this paragraph. It isn't actually the core paragraph block, even though that's what it looks like. I just drastically simplified it. So some of the editor components that you use can also have helper components for saving. So you might save something like this rich text.content component. That's a pattern for if you're using the rich text component in your edit function, which if you're using HTML, you'll probably be doing because it brings in a lot of helpful functionality like the toolbar, and really lets you have that kind of rich text interface. So what's more important to know in the save function, like I said before, is you can totally control the HTML output. So you really do need to think about the structure of your block. You can also save straight to a string. For a while, we were doing this, something like this on the WooCommerce product blocks because we just wanted the block to be an interface for editing the shortcode. And that worked for a while because shortcodes are pretty terrible to have to work with. So any kind of nice interface on top of it was a plus. You can also return null from the save function, and that'll just create an empty block in the post content. So like the latest posts that we saw at the beginning of the slides, it just saves the block comment. If you do this, you're probably rendering the content itself from PHP, and that's not really the topic for this conference, so I'm not really going to talk about it. If you want even more detail about what I've just been talking about, I've got a few slides through this presentation where I'm going to like point you back towards Gutenberg core code, because it was, for me at least, I find it to be pretty easy to read. It's well commented, well documented. So if you're interested in that, the serialize block function will show you the walkthrough of getting from block content to a string of content for the database, and that's the thing that runs save. If you're more interested in the real behind the scenes of how it renders an element to a string, render to string in the element package is what you should look at. That's what converts it down. So anyway, now we know that the save function will put all of our data into a form that will live in the post content, and that's what's saved into the database. But how do we get it back from the database into something that we can work with in the editor? So that's that's done by parsing it, and the parser works by looking at the block attributes. So back over to the register block type function, we were talking about the attributes a little bit before, but we didn't dive into it. Now we're actually going to dive into that. So yeah. So attributes are essentially a schema, a description of these items, of the data points that you want to use in your block. For example, on the screen right now, we have this attribute list that's got a URL, which is a string, text, well, they're all strings, and background color. And then you can see that they each have different sources. Background color doesn't have a source. They each look a little different. So you can kind of tell already that this is describing something about where these things are coming from and what they do. So let's dive into more details. To start out with, attributes can be strings, booleans, integers, or numbers, which seem to be the same thing, objects or arrays. Not every type is compatible with every source, and we'll talk about that more as I talk about what sources are. So sources, you can have a default, attribute, text, HTML, query, and meta. Well, and a few others that didn't quite make this list, but we'll get there. So let's dive into what each of these mean. So if you don't give a source, it defaults to looking for the data in the comment. So here we see the rendered content of the block it's got the WP heading comment with this JSON level 3. So by just by doing by saying that we have an attribute called level, it will know to look in this comment for this level, and then it will pull it out and populate that with that value, so 3. You can also set a default value to the attribute. So the value will actually only be added to the attribute content or to the comment content if it's different than the default. So in this case, we either never set the value, so it's always been 2, or we changed it back to 2. And it just tries to be minimal and doesn't bother putting in when we know we can just inherit it from the default. So in this case, level would also be 2. So some blocks that use the default values are actually almost all of them, but heading and latest posts are one you can look at. So the next few sources pulled directly from the HTML itself. In addition to parsing out the comment tags, there's also an HTML parser that can read all your blocks HTML and get data that way. So here we're going to get data from an attribute. It is a little confusing that the attribute has a source of attribute, but it means the attribute in an HTML tag. So that's this part of the tag itself. So here we're setting up this label, which is going to be a string. And we are going to read it from this content. We know that we're going to have a div with the aria label attribute on it. And that's the content that we want to be able to control with this code. So in this case, it knows to look at the div because of the selector property that we've passed in. And then the attribute itself is specified with this attribute property. So it knows to look at the aria label. And then that means that it pulls out the correct content of an editable label into our label attribute. You can also say that attributes are Boolean values. This is pretty useful for if you're passing in like a data, if you're passing data to the front end for, say, like a JavaScript rendered block on the front end. So you can do this to pass through this data value. But say we have this example with this Boolean value, data has count. What if we have it in the code and it's false? Well, unfortunately, it reads it as true because it exists. So if you have a Boolean value from an attribute, you actually want to make sure that you only have it set or not set, because any existence of it is considered true. That tripped me up somewhat recently, so making a point of it. Anyway, some blocks that use that are the audio and button block have the attribute source. The text source can be used for a string of unformatted content, since it strips out any HTML from the code. In this case, we're going to set up a content attribute, and we're going to pull it from the my content selector. You'll see that I'm using the kind of class name syntax here. You can do that, and it will pull out the correct HTML element from the code. The parser knows how to handle that. And so you can set up more complicated HTML output and still break your data down into kind of manageable pieces. So in this case, the attribute content is going to pull out of this pre-tag because it's got that my content class on it. So we'll see that label, mistake in my slides. That should be attributes.content equals, this is the attribute value. So the only block I think that uses this is the code block. Everything else uses HTML. So the HTML source type is, again, it's going to give you a string. It's useful if you're rendering content with HTML in it, which you probably are letting people edit HTML in the editor. So this will probably be a pretty commonly used source. And this, it also uses the selector. So in this case, it's going to grab that P and the content inside of it. You'll probably, I know I said I wasn't going to talk about editing components, but you're probably going to use this with the rich text component to render the HTML. So you just get a lot by doing it. Like I said earlier, you get the toolbar, like easier formatting. You don't actually have to handle that yourself. So if you're using the rich text, you can default to the single element by saying like tag name P, and that will just keep, that will just be one P with content inside of it, one paragraph tag. You can also have this be a heading or a caption or whatever. But you could also say that the element is multi-line, like it's a div that has multiple paragraphs in it. In this case, the selector from the last example won't work because your HTML will probably look something like this, but the selector is still looking for that P tag, so it doesn't know which one to grab. The HTML source attribute also has another property called multi-line, and that will let you set up this multi-line, much like the rich text property. So in this case, it grabs both lines of paragraph tags, but it still gives you a string. It doesn't give you an array. It's still just a string. So blocks that use the HTML, some good examples to look at are the button block. The quote block uses both the multi-line for the quote itself and the non-multi-line for the citation. So if we want to build on all of those that we've just talked about, you can also use source query. And this builds out an object based on the things you pass into that query property. So in this case, we're passing children. So we're going to end up with an array of objects, each with a children property to it. And we know that we're going to get, basically it looks at the selector we've set on content, which is the paragraph P again, and it will look at each paragraph, and over that it will run the query. So then it says for each P, we want to pull out the HTML source and put it into children. So if we have this example where we've got some kind of nested divs and paragraphs, it will end up giving us this kind of value out of there, where it's an array of objects with that content in it. So things that use the query source are the gallery block and the text columns block, which is deprecated, but it was actually the thing that made me understand how this worked. So if you're interested in code helps you figure out how things work, I would look at that. So the source tag is not really documented at the moment. I think it might be pretty new. It is literally just the tag name of the selector that you find. So for example, we can say this tag should be the value of the selector my content, class my content. So in this example, we have the H3 with the class name my content on it. Then we know that the tag will be an H3. I really didn't update my slides correctly. That should say attributes.tag. Damn. Okay. So that is actually only being used in the table block right now. It is used to see if it's a table header or table cell. Okay, so we've kind of moved away from the things that are in content. Meta here is another source you can have, and that's referring to post meta. So with this attribute source, you're going to like save and pull right from the database, not from the content. So in this example, we're setting up a price with the meta name demo price. And so that is going to be the key for your meta. We're going to say it's an integer and it'll default to 0. You'll need to set this one up with PHP because it is post meta. You need to register it correctly. So you'll set up for your post type, whichever that is, and then the meta key that you used in the attribute. And you'll need to say that show and rest is true. Otherwise, the editor won't have access to it. We're also saying that it should be a single and an integer. So it shouldn't be a set of data. And that, yeah, it should be an integer. So what you don't want to do with this is actually update the HTML with it because it won't work well. If you're using this kind of attribute, you're really just going to be saving it to the database and pulling it out. If you want to do something with it on the front end, you'll probably have a dynamic block in PHP. If you actually want to render content anymore, I suppose you could use this to set something else on the page somewhere. That could be kind of interesting. And so adding more than one of these blocks, if you create a block with meta source type, it doesn't, if you have more than one on a page and you change the value of one of the blocks, it will update all of them. So it doesn't end up out of sync. So no core blocks actually use meta. So no examples to show. Custom sources are a potential future maybe thing. So if you think about it, post content is great for just you writing your posts. But if we eventually want to expand the editor to handle more site editing tasks, we need to be able to change things like the post title or even site settings. So custom sources are a possible solution to this. I have only really seen issues and such in the past week or so talking about this, so it's still very much in progress. I'm also personally not involved in that at all. I just thought it was pretty cool. So register custom source isn't a real function, it's just an idea. But you could potentially build a block that then has its own separate data management where you can set and pull your data from other places. So there is a pull request that got merged that moves the handling of meta, like I just talked about, into this custom source idea. So if you're interested in looking at it, those are some PRs to check out. If you want to hear, want to see more detail about every step of the process for parsing out attributes from the content, then get block attribute is the function that actually does all of this. And that's in the blocks package. And then behind the scenes is the HPQ parser library that actually does the parsing of all of this data. And so there's a fun little explorer where you can add in a bunch of content and some kind of query attributes to see how it actually works. So we've talked through serialization, saving the block back to this database. We've talked about pulling the data out of that HTML and saved block content into the editor. But let's actually try to kind of put it all together by talking through a practice block. So we're going to make a pull block. This example of this pull will have a question, a set number of options, well, a configurable number of options, which you can then change, and then a button to vote. So it will look like this on the back end, and then on the front end, it's just going to render something pretty simple. So this is a field set with a legend. So a legend. The options will all be labels, and then the button will be a button. And so if we keep this syntax in mind for how we're going to mark up the front end, we can think about that when we're talking about how to build that attribute object. So if we walk through this again, we can say that we want the question up here to be editable inline, and we want to allow people to make things bold or italics. So we'll call that one question, and we'll let it be an HTML type source. Over on the side here, we have the setting for how many options that we want to let people pick. And so that's going to be just a default option because we don't need to save it to the HTML. So that'll just get saved into that comment, into the JSON in the comment. Our options are going to be that query type because we see there's a list of them, and that makes sense to pull it out as a list because you don't need to get all of that data. You really only need each label. So the labels will be pulled out individually inside that query. And then those will be HTML as well because we'll let people have things like bold and italics and so on. But the button, we don't need to let people bold text in the button. So we'll just have that one be a text source. So all of that put together ends up looking something like this, where we have the count options is the query, and it each pulls each label out. Question again is HTML, and it pulls out that legend selector, and so it's the content of that. And then submit label again is the button, but it's going to be a text source, so just the text from that button, and we'll give it the default value of submit. But back here we've already customized to say vote. Oops. All right. So now we'll talk about block validation, because every user's favorite thing in the world is to see this this block contains unexpected or invalid content. So how does this happen, and how can we prevent this from happening? What it actually means is that when the block attempted to parse out your content, it couldn't reconcile what it pulled out with what it came from. So it when the editor loads, here we'll go over here. When the editor loads, it tries to read the HTML from the database and pull that out, parse it out into the state. And then immediately it tries to reserialize it, and then it tries to match it to that saved post content. And so if that content doesn't match, so if it pulls out that your count attribute should be 4, and then when it tries to save it and it sees that it was actually 5 and those don't match anymore, that's when you get that invalid block error. So if those two don't match, something wrong, something bad happened. It doesn't know how to get from point A to point B, basically. And so you get that error. So things that can cause this, or if you've changed where an attribute is sourced from. So if we actually go back to, let's go back here. Say we were to set up this whole block that we were talking about, and then we decide that this doesn't make sense as a legend. We want to put it somewhere else. Well, everyone who's already used this block already has this content saved in legend. So when the parser tries to go over someone's new block where it's maybe now looking for it in a paragraph tag, it won't find the right content there. So when it tries to resave it, it won't work. So that's one way that this is a problem. And so the way to get around that is transforms, block transforms, which I wasn't planning on talking about today. So the other option is that maybe your HTML changed by another plugin or was changed by the user manually, and kind of the same thing happened where the block and the parser went looking for content in a place where content didn't exist. So actually, I think that's it. We've gone through how you get from the database to the block state and back from the block state to the database. And that's my talk. So thank you.
Awesome, thank you. There's already one question in the site that says, is there a way to make changes to an existing block, like adding more functionality without getting this error?
Yeah, so that's the block transforms that I didn't really have slides for, so I wasn't really going to talk about it. But basically you say, or deprecations, not transforms. I'm using the wrong word, sorry. Transforms are cool too, but that's not what I meant to say. So deprecated, you can say that your block has a deprecated property to it when you register it. And what you'll do is you'll pull in all of the attributes and the old save function into this deprecated property. And then you can also tell it how to map the attributes from that kind of before to after. So your old way of doing things should now map to this new way of doing things, and that's where that is. And I'm not going to have more coherent answer than that because I'm not looking at the documentation. But the Gutenberg documentation around this is actually really awesome.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on here and spending your time with us to share your insights. And this has been great.